Any questions for any of the speakers or general thoughts? And if not, I'll maybe pose some questions to you. So think of something, or others I might put you on the spot. Oh, no, no break. We're just going to finish. We're going to power through and we're going to finish. Okay, question for any of the speakers, yeah. Yes, for any of the speakers, yeah. Go ahead.
So somebody was talking about trying to satisfy the different interests, including the whitewater rafters or the boaters. I'm wondering, how did that work out? I didn't quite catch how that worked out with them during the summer, when flows might want different flows for fish and people. And I know the rafters like to go all summer long, so I wasn't sure how that worked out.
No, thanks. It's hard to summarize a lot of work in 15 minutes, so I appreciate the question. So it was a really interesting process. The boaters, what we found, a lot of it was education of the boating community. So the boating community wanted to be able to go on weekends in the summer when they have the best recreation opportunity. But I think a lot of folks didn't realize that by doing these out-of-season pulse flows once a month, that it was having really negative impacts on both the frog community as well as the benthic macroinvertebrate community. They're, you guys would all know here, they're creating large amounts of catastrophic drift once a month, and it was just absolutely trashing the system. So a large part of that was talking to the folks at American Whitewater and explaining the studies and going through and sitting in stakeholder groups and showing a lot of the community the science that we had been doing. And a lot of the rafting community, they're actually quite pro-environmental, right? They love to be out, they love to be on the river. The fly fishing community was heavily involved in this as well, and they, for their recreation purposes, wanted to have a more healthy river, right? And have the macroinvertebrate community come back. So it took some time to talk and to educate, but once we sort of made that goal and a lot of folks realized, hey, I don't want to be trashing on the frogs when I'm out doing my boating, then there was a decision to try to take their flow allocation, which they had won, and basically stack that volume of water in the spring and shape that volume of water so that it benefited both spring flows and recreation flows. The alternative would have been that the Forest Service might have just taken away their flow allocation because the negative impacts on the biology were pretty high at that point in time. So from the rafters perspective, okay, I'd rather have the opportunity to boat in the spring and know that I'm helping the environment rather than not have lost my flow allocation. And the reality is that most of the rivers, you can really only boat in the spring anyway. There's a handful that the whitewater community, South Fork American is one, Tuolumne is one. So there are places to go boat, and people look for more places to boat, but also understanding that really the best time to boat is in spring, and the more rivers that we can open up in springtime and help the environment ended up being a good kind of PR piece for them and a lot of that. So it really was a long process. I mean, this was sort of like a 4 to 5 year sort of negotiation, but that's sort of how the outcome came out. Yeah.
You have a question in the back here?
Yeah, I've been hearing a lot of mention over the last year or so about the National Water Model effort that NOAA is doing to develop a real-time instantaneous flow model of all the streams in America. And I think there's maybe another effort that I've heard David Maidman at University of Texas is involved in to do a similar thing. And I'm just wondering how that kind of modeling will factor into the kind of stuff you guys are all trying to do with O/E predictions, for example. I mean, it may leapfrog ahead on being able to do a lot more with expected flow statistics and things like that.
We were trying to caucus to see. Okay. Oh, Ted, take the first one.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with the details of those efforts, but I think the models to predict unimpaired flows or predict flows at ungauged basins is our capability to do that is rapidly advancing, and these models are getting better and better. And I think that we'll use whatever information we can to inform this process. And I think that, from what I understand, that NOAA work could be really helpful as yet another source of information to sort of both kind of validate our own models, but potentially to guide setting environmental flow attributes. I would say that a lot of these models, particularly in the flood prediction models, tend to do a really good job at predicting certain attributes of the flow regime, like floods, like peak flows, because that's what they're designed for. And so there's probably very selective uses for those types of models that can be particularly beneficial, but maybe not for all dimensions of the flow regime that we might have an interest in from an environmental flow perspective.
And one thing I might add is, in working with our technical work group, this issue, and Jeanette alluded to it, this issue of scale becomes really important, right? Because ultimately we envision there might be sort of a tiering of how you think about this, right? So some of the models that operate at these larger spatial scales are maybe good for some initial screening and ranking and prioritization, and then when you sort of come into some of the real site-specific questions, then maybe you have to tunnel into a more deterministic or process-driven model to supplement that and explore different management scenarios. So I would envision there's hopefully some sort of tiering that occurs where we can take advantage of the different tools at different scales to answer those questions. So is that a question over here somewhere?
Just a question about the next steps as far as the collaborative approach and the framework. I mean, what form is that taking? Is this a series of workshops, and are you looking towards developing a document, a framework document, or something like that? And how would we tap into all that?
What would you like, Lori? Do you want to take a shot? Well, I don't have actually, I was looking at Jeanette to help me out here. I don't really actually have a good answer to the question, because it actually, right now, I think it's been a little bit ad hoc, to be honest with you, because, what's happened is on the technical side, a lot of the folks working on this, we've sort of realized we're sort of working to common goals and approaching it from different angles, and so we've tried to self-organize a little bit to try to take advantage and leverage our efforts and our thought process. But I think part of the reason we wanted to have this period of time at the end of the panel for this discussion is for exactly the type of question you raised, is sort of to pose the question in a sense back to the group in terms of what would be an appropriate framework in terms of, are there existing structures like healthy watersheds, for example, that might create a framework that we could work within to work with the managers and the regulators. Obviously, we envision some sort of documentation to pull this all together, and hopefully some sets of tools that we can make available in a web accessible format. But in terms of the best way to interact with the end users, that's part of the feedback we're hoping to get, through this dialogue. So I sort of tongue-in-cheek put it back on you, but not really, because in a sense that's, if folks in the room have some suggestions for a venue or forum, that would be really helpful for us, because right now we're sort of kind of self-organizing to try to move the process forward. So any thoughts on that for folks in the room?
I work with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and
Here, microphone.
I work with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and a directive from our governor was for us to really look at what's going on in the streams during this is the 6th year of drought. Even though we had a good rain winter, we're still in a drought. And so our fisheries people have been doing a lot of data gathering on the streams, and you should probably check in with them. I am in the timber conservation program, and so when when industry wants to draft water, we're very strict on maintaining flow for fish and having the water be deep enough and cold enough, and looking at the wetted perimeter and the critical flow as measurements.
So would you say that there is a work group or some sort of forum for more direct interaction? I mean, we've interacted with some of the in-stream flows work group over the years, and Jeanette showed the map for some of the work that they've done, but do you have a specific suggestion?
We have a fisheries branch. I'd contact them.
Okay, super. Yeah, okay.
I had a question about the change detection methods that's being used, specifically the EO ratio, the OE ratio that you use. Isn't it, the way you get to making an observation versus the way you calculate E, isn't it almost like comparing apples with oranges?
Were you referring more to on the biology side or the hydrology side, or both?
either side, when you're coming up with the value for the expected value, but you're basing it on a series of regression equations to come to that number, you're making an observation by going out and making an observation, two very different methods, and then you're trying to take a ratio out of that. I was just curious if is it comparable?
Well, I'd say on the hydrology side, you do have, well, particularly for the approach that I described, where it's this process-based approach, you are sort of modeling a response to a modeled difference, and so you are in danger of sort of losing the message in the data with so much processing. And so I think this really just speaks to the fact that, like, you have to validate your results really well. You have to see that the responses you're observing really in fact make sense. So, like, you want to know, are you really observing, are people, you know, increasing the length of floods or decreasing the length of floods? What makes more sense? You want to make sure that, you know, everything passes the smell test. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in this regard is really the lack of flow data makes our validations, particularly for our estimates of historic conditions, not as strong as I think I'd like them to be. But I think one of the advantages of regression models is that you do have this reference-based approach to provide a bit more of a robust validation in that regard. So that's what I would say.
Ted, do you want to add anything to that? Phil?
It's probably tagging on with the previous question, but you know, you talk about different beneficial uses and balancing things, but even among the biological systems, there's different priorities and beneficial uses, and it's something we've certainly struggled with in Southern California, dealing particularly with endangered species. And you can manage for Santa Ana suckers, but if you try to manage what, you know, a more natural regime, that isn't going to work really well. Now, back in the day when the Santa Ana sucker was not an endangered species and we didn't have these refuge pockets of them, that probably wasn't a problem. But, you know, we get pushback with that, as well as terrestrial species. I mean, we've got to maintain arundo groves because least Bell's vireos are actually utilizing them. And if we went with a more Mediterranean, with a drawdown in a dry out cycle to encourage more native plant growth, we'd be having an impact on threatened and endangered species. So Fish and Wildlife, California, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I think, probably needs to be involved in a lot of these discussions, because if we go to a natural regime, there's going to be problems with that because they want to manage for a particular endangered species, which I don't think is necessarily inappropriate, but different.
Right, and I'll let others, I know, well, you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, and that, you know, so clearly there's lots, because we're dealing with highly modified systems and limited sort of remnant populations, right, these become really challenging issues, right? And I think Rafi, on one of his graphs when he showed, I think it was the Sycamore Creek hydrograph, and was showing that as we manage to return to closer to reference conditions, we're actually decreasing flows to get closer to reference conditions, which may or may not be desirable from a specific endangered species perspective, right? Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that creates potential trade-offs that you have to consider. So I don't know if anybody else. I don't have an answer for you, but. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you. 100 years ago, the upper watersheds of the Sierra had a 7 to 15-year fire cycle, and now there's 50-year fires, or there will be 100-year fires. How is the changing fire regime disturbing the flow regime of the rivers?
Well, I'm actually really glad you asked that question, and I'll start, but I'm also going to see if Sarah wants to chime in, because yeah, I think that is a really important issue, and I know that, you know, we've done some work in Southern California and other places in the state to know. I think the shift in fire regime, in terms of sort of one of the impacts, particularly of drought and climate change, that I think gets less attention than probably it should, is the shifting fire regime and the implications for the shifting fire regime on hydrology of these systems, right? As you mentioned, less, you know, more severe, more extensive, more impactful types of burns that have the potential to have much more systemic alteration on the system. So there's been work in the literature that's suggested that in some cases we may not expect these systems to come, we may expect these systems to come back into a very different type of habitat than what we've observed. So you may have, you know, a forest that's been there for many decades, and following one of these catastrophic burns, it may recover into a very different type of system. So sort of a system redirection in a sense. And so that implications of that from a hydrologic perspective and what that means for management are, I think, an important element for the long-term management, and probably something that I know there's been a lot of work on the fire ecology side looking at some of these issues that needs to be brought into these discussions, because these, you know, infrequent or maybe becoming more frequent catastrophic types of events, I think, have the potential to sort of alter the trajectory of these systems for long periods of time. So I think it's a really important consideration.
Thanks. I'll just add to what Eric says. Two things came to mind that just building on what you said. First of all is that I think things like the change in the fire regime and things like climate warming really speak to the need for management to be adaptive. And so in our framework, as we move forward in the way that we do our environmental flow recommendations, I think adaptive management has to be a huge element of that we take into consideration. I know, for example, in a couple, because a lot of my work is with the SWRCB folks, a couple of the licenses, they've actually built adaptive management into the licenses where they revisit the flow regimes every 5 years and evaluate whether the environmental flows that and the flow regimes they've managed are continuing to be beneficial. So I would just add that comment that I think that's one way we can help deal with these changing issues in the future. The second thought that came to mind was the importance of the reference sites in this. So this Sierra Nevada in particular, Dave Herbst I think is going to talk about it tomorrow. A lot of the reference sites in the headwater reaches of the Sierra, I think, are going to become that much more valuable for us in the future, so that we can see what impacts like the change in fire regime or the climate change will have on these reference sites, which can then help us then have information and guide a decision about how we then want to manage our systems. And at that point, it may become more of a social or a value-weighted system. Do we want to try to manage our regulated systems in a way that's like the new change systems, or do we actually want to use those places as a preservation of more historic flow regimes? And that's actually a big question in some of our rivers for fish. Do we maintain cold water habitat at lower elevations that it never was because that's what's important for the fish, knowing that that is not a natural thermal regime or a natural flow regime? And that becomes a social value discussion.
Any other questions? Nope. Oh, there's a couple more.
Tell me how you're going to start that conversation. Because I have that conversation every day, and whenever I mention the word model to an average person, they get scared as hell because that's mathematics. And what the hell does mathematics have to do with biology?
Does your owners want that or no?
There's a pass. No takers on that one, huh? Okay, Rafi's the brave soul.
I will put
out, Rafi.
There's tomorrow afternoon, there is a talk about science communication. I hope this issue does come up. We do have fairly complicated tools, fairly sophisticated models, but they really are only devices to help you tell a story, and they're not crucial necessarily to explain all the details when you're talking to an audience that isn't interested in those details. So I think we really have to learn how to interpret the numbers and communicate what are they telling us. For example, when I talk about Sycamore Creek, it's not that, you know, you've raised Q99 back to what it was in 1993, but rather, you know, you're reverting it to its historic state. I think that's something that you can communicate better. So you have to find ways to communicate, ways to visualize your information that really speaks to a broad audience. And I would say that that's not just about communicating with the public, but communicating with each other too. Because I think, you know, it's just a general good policy to try to craft your message accordingly.
Thanks. Hi, I'm with Cal EPA, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and we have what we call a risk communication training. We do a lot of risk communication training. And part of that is how to talk about modeling techniques, mathematical techniques that we use in our work, but communicate how we interpret that to the public in a way that, one, hopefully they can kind of understand, not necessarily like how to do it, but what the process is, and also not to just go into fear mode, which is what oftentimes, either they go into total fear mode or they shut down because, as you say, oh my God, it's math and I can't, how to, yeah. So, but there are ways. And one of the ways is speak plain English and not communicate like you're in a room of scientists who already have a background in whatever it is that you're doing. So there are ways that you can do it, and I can put you in touch with people from my department who actually develop these courses along with, I'm a toxicologist, and so, we work with we have a department, a specific group of people who do who do the public relations type services. So they actually go out, they do the surveys, they set up the meetings, and so there's so we actually have a lot of training in how do you communicate this information to the people to whom it's relevant in a way that, that they can participate in the process and not feel like you're just some talking heads and, and then they are resisting everything, so.
Great.
The other little point earlier that I think it's Julie Zimmerman was talking about coordinating, and one of the things in my department also is this, it's called Safer Consumer Products Group that's working on regulations for chemicals that are in products used by people that could be harmful to them or that could make it into the environment. And so there's an aquatic group, so the aquatic piece is really important in that. So I think we're kind of coming in the back door, not so much looking at water flow and watersheds and things like that, but the other side of how things actually can get into the water system, and that might be people that you want to be in touch with, because there is an aquatic group, so I can get you that information if you'd like.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it's coming up on 4 o'clock, so before I turn it over to Jim, I don't see any more hands up there. First, a few things. First, I want to, there's another question?
Time for one more?
Yes, I didn't see you. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add to that communication piece, it's a little bit of a plug, to watershed groups that involve a lot of citizen science, and they are actually gathering the science, coming up with some of the questions, looking for the answers. And so I think to partner with some nonprofit watershed groups is another way to really communicate well to the public.
Great, yeah, great suggestion, yeah. And yeah, those are great suggestions because as Sarah alluded to, I mean, there's a lot of stakeholders and it's important to give all the stakeholders a chance to participate in that process. So I'm going to turn over to Jim, but I wanted to first, once again, thank all of our speakers. So thank you all our speakers. I wanted to thank all of you for some great questions and suggestions. So I really appreciate the interaction, the dialogue. Definitely see any of us if you have other thoughts afterwards or you have ideas.